Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. It was Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent to him, saying, Lord, he whom you love is ill. But when Jesus heard it, he said, This illness does not lead to death. It is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Then after this, he said to the disciples, Let us go to Judea again. The disciples said to him, Rabbi, the Jews were just now seeking to stone you, and are you going there again? Jesus answered, Are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble, because he sees the light of this world. But if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles, because the light is not in him. After saying these things, he said to them, Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go to awaken him. The disciples said to him, Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will recover. Now Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought that he meant taking rest in sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, Lazarus has died. And for your sake I am glad that I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him. So Thomas, called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, Let us also go, that we may die with him. Now when Jesus came, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off. And many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brother. So when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, but Mary remained seated in the house. Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you. Jesus said to her, Your brother will rise again. Martha said to him, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? She said to him, Yes, Lord. I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world. When she had said this, she went and called her sister Mary, saying in private, The teacher is here and is calling you. And when she heard it, she rose and quickly went to him. Now Jesus had not yet come into the village, but was still in the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who were with her in the house, consoling her, saw Mary rising quickly and go out, they followed her, supposing that she was going to the tomb to weep there. Now when Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet, saying to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. And he said, Where have you laid him? They said to him, Lord, come and see. Jesus wept. So the Jews said, See how he loved him? But some of them said, Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man also have kept this man from dying? Then Jesus, deeply moved again, came to the tomb. It was a cave. A stone lay against it. Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, "Lord, by this time there will be an odor, for he has been dead 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. And Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I know that you always hear me, but I said this on account of the people standing around, that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The man who had died came out, his hands and feet bound with linen strips and his face wrapped with a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." Many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary, had seen what he did, believed in him. Here ends our gospel reading for this morning.
Thanks be to God.
So, as we think about this rather long reading, which is one story, we find this happens just outside of Jerusalem in a little town called Bethany. And this is a really odd story on so many levels, isn't it?
Yes, it's full of
contradictions in the social hierarchy too, and from Jesus' perspective, because you see his struggle with how people expect him to be, and he has to follow his father's guides and to show something that people don't expect, and that he has to let things actually go by first. Like Lazarus has to die for him to show that. Mm-hmm. And that's definitely what stood out too, is that we are, even right now, we're thinking that God needs to prevent things. But this story is all about showing after the fact, to make it even more profound in his actions. And we don't often see that. So
yes,
we just see the sorrow that everybody has.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and I think it's helpful to remember that this is the place that we have the most record of Jesus hanging out. It was with Mary and Martha and Lazarus.
Yes.
This was...
Yeah.
Well, some commentators actually think that when the Gospel of John refers to the beloved disciple, it could be Lazarus, because Lazarus is clearly Jesus' best friend. And so when he hears this news of his best friend being ill, it's interesting when you think about this. This isn't just some blind stranger who we met last week.
No. Somebody he's very close to.
Someone he's very close to.
Part of his connect group, or his small group.
Part of his inner circle. I mean, these guys, this household, these three are probably closer to Jesus than the 12. Mm-hmm. And had a profoundly intimate relationship with him, which is linked again not only by Jesus and Lazarus' friendship, but also Mary's response to Jesus as well, that is again mentioned in this passage.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because even at that time, they think that he could have prevented it, and then their fate still says, but whatever God wants will be done. Like, I mean, their perception was, they must have thought in the back of their mind, why didn't he do it? Why didn't he prevent this?
Well, yeah, there's clearly an understanding that Mary and Martha were talking with each other and saying, you know, if Jesus was just here, things would be different.
We say that a lot, though, don't we?
Yeah.
We're not seeing the whole picture. We often just, why didn't God prevent this happening? Why didn't God prevent this COVID-19? Why didn't God prevent the bubonic plague many years ago? We ask those questions while we're in the midst of the trouble, this strife, this season.
But Jesus has an interesting response to the crisis, doesn't he? Jesus isn't overwhelmed by the crisis, isn't absent to the crisis. He's present to the crisis, but he approaches the crisis from a completely different perspective of calm and a confidence that even in this, when he tells his disciples, Lazarus has died, he has a confidence that even in this death, God would be glorified.
Yes. Yes.
But even because the disciples actually didn't get the first time when he said too, he's fallen asleep. Like, I mean, they are not expecting any of this reaction actually. So they're totally distraught and oh, then it must be not as bad. That is the type of thinking that I get if I were to hear something like that. So, and then they don't get it, and so he has to change it to actually say, well,
But when he tells the disciples, he says, Lazarus has died, and for your sake I am glad that I was not there, so that you may believe.
Yeah.
He knows something bigger is happening in this whole picture, in this time, than he was sharing right there. I like Thomas's reaction here. We often call Thomas the doubter, but look at his enthusiasm here. He's the first one to jump up and say, well, let's go, that we may die with him.
He doesn't really get a fair shake, does he?
No, I mean, he's really...
But even then, he doesn't realize what he's actually saying there.
No.
For sure not what's going to happen, of course, because he wouldn't otherwise say it that way.
Yeah.
But it's clear Lazarus was dead.
Yes,
Yeah.
very much.
Even the note that he was dead 4 days is interesting, because in the ancient Jewish understanding, there was this whole notion that, you know, for 3 days, the soul or the soul of the body kind of lingered around the body, and then after the third day, it departed.
Yep.
So the first 3 days of mourning kind of had some hope to them.
That's right. Yep.
You know, maybe it was just a coma or whatnot. But now it's clear it's been 4 days, and just in case we don't get it, right? When Jesus asks for the stone to be moved, there's this great response. We're in Bethany, it's in the Middle East, it's warm here, it's going to smell if we open that.
Yeah.
Really, there's no denial of the reality of death.
Most of this story is really emphasizing the fact that Lazarus was dead. We have a lot of text there that's telling the story, the journey, and that sort of thing, but it's really emphasizing how dead Lazarus was, for me.
and you see the human reaction to all that in the story, constantly as an opposite to Jesus and the Father's responses to that.
It's not till the last few sentences that we find that Jesus raises him to new life.
Yeah, and also by calling, not even going in. Like, I mean, that's another thing. It is a distant one, which I actually find interesting in our current situation too. Is God can heal without you having to look at him.
Well, there's two actions where God, in this story, Jesus says, do something, And it's the others who are being obedient in doing something that are participating in making the healing a reality. Like, first it's move the stone. Jesus doesn't move the stone himself. Others are participating in opening the grave. And then after Lazarus walks out, the same thing. Lazarus walks out all bound in his grave
Still
clothes.
in bondage.
I
he's-
wondered how did he walk out? It says clearly that he's pretty good bound.
Like
I
a
guess they didn't
like
bind
a
his legs
penguin.
together.
Yeah, so I mean,
Maybe they didn't bind his legs together. He didn't have to hop out like a mermaid.
I have no idea. So that's a thing.
But
that
it's interesting because
was intriguing me. So
it's really a two-stage healing.
Yes.
We have the physical healing of being raised from the dead and walking out, but then we have the healing from the bondage where he's bound up in the bondage of his life, and so we, like the stories we've been going through the last few weeks, the woman at the well and the man born blind and healed. There was that physical component to the healing, and then there was a spiritual component to the healing. And we're seeing that. I think we see the same thing here with Lazarus. You know, he had life, but he was still bound by the grave clothes. And then Jesus releases him from the grave clothes, and he goes on to becoming a great living witness, just like the woman at the well, and the blind man born from blind. They went on to become great living witnesses, coming out of that spiritual healing as much as the physical healing.
But it's really interesting to me to see the activity of others involved in the healing activity of Jesus. It's not just Jesus waving some sort of magic wand to make things happen. He is engaging the society and culture.
Yep. But that's the thing too. Is he first shows his human side because he wept.
Yes.
Yeah, so he first shows his human side doing that, and then the response is then overwhelming in a reaction that nobody there was anticipating.
Yeah, and I don't think Jesus weeps because he's grieving Lazarus' death. I think Jesus weeps because he is the resurrection and the life, and no one sees him as that.
No.
It's the same kind of response that he has when a week later he approaches Jerusalem and he breaks down in tears again for that same reason. They do not know who I am.
Yeah.
No. And that is why it clearly states too that he is saying this, and he makes it known that he's saying it so that they may believe.
Yes.
In John 5:40, it says, Jesus said, "Yet you refuse to come to me to have life." And you're seeing all of this, you're seeing me raise the dead, and yet you refuse to come to me and have that healing and to live in the freedom that I can provide. And I wonder how many of us are there. Certainly in the world, outside of the church, the majority of people are refuse to receive what Jesus has for them. But even within the church,
well, even Mary and Martha don't seem to get it. They're saying the right things.
Yep.
Yeah.
They're saying all the right things, but their actions clearly indicate that their head and their heart have a gap. That they what they know to be true, they don't know to be true.
They don't see the full capacity of his being there, his powers and his impact, because they still they think they put a limit on what he can do. That is almost if I read that, that's how I see it.
Yes,
But
yes, I know someday the resurrection will
but
occur.
then they say, I do believe. But they have, just in the sentence before, they put a limit on it because he should have been there. He could have prevented it.
And we all have that kind of a box that we want to try and fit God into, which is never big enough. And in actual fact, with God, there really isn't a box at all. It's the Samaritan woman putting down her jar and running it away. She's left her system behind to have a new life with Jesus.
Yeah.
So even we see a transformation not only in Lazarus in him being raised from the dead, but I think we also see a profound transformation in Mary and Martha, these two friends who were closest to Jesus.
Yeah.
They knew the right things. They had followed Jesus' teachings very closely and could mouth them back to him. But the reality of his teaching hadn't taken root in their life to actually have that kind of confident faith that had the peace, because they were struggling, right? Well, if he would have just been here, if he would have just been here, and I think often I'm more like Mary and Martha than I care to. If Jesus would just do something, then everything would be okay.
And not like just one of them, but both of them at the same time sometimes.
But I do believe.
I believe. I really do. But
that's why I'm working hard to sit at your feet.
It's almost as if they have a someday maybe kind of faith. But then this event changes that.
Yeah.
And perhaps, as we look at our current situation, I know my faith is being challenged from, being a someday maybe kind of hope to a desperate need for hope as, friends and relatives start getting sick, and the reality of viral infections becomes not just somewhere, but someone. My faith is really like, where is it parked? Is it just parked in someday maybe, or is it parked in the reality that Jesus is who he says he is, the resurrection and the life? And what does that look like?
Yeah, and every day, not just on Easter Sunday. We're going to have our Easter Sunday, which is the day of celebrating that resurrection power in the church calendar, and we do it really well once a year. But in actual fact, we have that resurrection power within us all the time. And how do we live that out?
Yeah.
How do we be like Jesus in this season? We kind of wound up last week going in the same direction, and I think the stories we've been through the last 4 weeks lead us in that direction. Is how can we help Jesus make disciples? How can we be a disciple to another person?
And how is our faith living an active faith?
The last 4 weeks with Nicodemus and the woman at the well and the man born blind healed, Lazarus this week, each of them met Jesus. Each of them were taught and healed and freed by Jesus, and they had to leave their old ways. The old life was no longer, for Lazarus, I mean, that was, the old life was no longer anything. And then each became witnesses.
Yeah.
And so how do we witness today? How can we get out there and meet the people without being in closer than 2 meters? How can we be Jesus to everyone?
Because I do think Jesus meets each and every one in our need.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
And in our need, in our crisis, in our desperation. He says, I am the resurrection and the life.
Mm-hmm. I think we have to walk out in that, don't we?
Yeah.
I know. The times I've been in the mission field, and I've been kind of needing God every moment of the day. And somehow when I come and paint the bathrooms, I know I need God, but I don't really need him to help me paint the bathroom. He's equipped me pretty well on the natural end for doing things like that. And yet, he wants us to have that supernatural empowerment all the time. Yeah. The resurrection power.
And I think that's why this story is in John's gospel for us. It kind of brings to a close the signs and miracles that Jesus did. But more than that, it kind of says that nothing is beyond God's healing capacity. And
If we
I
believe.
think that is something that as we go forward in the next days, weeks, and perhaps even months, we will need to cling to. You know, as we have the health crisis and the economic crisis that are coming hand in fist.
The same as in the story too, that they are because of the physical interaction too. They have changed from there going forward, and that is what we are going to see too. Is this is a change, and it's such a dramatic change that we won't be the same as before.
It makes me think of John 10:10.